Welcome to Beyond the Battlefield, a Simver conversation on military, veteran, and family health. This series brings together researchers, organizational representatives, policymakers, and people with lived experience to discuss a broad range of topics relative to military, veteran, and family health from a variety of perspectives. I am Dr. Nicholas Held, the Interim Scientific Director of Simver, and today I am joined by a great group to talk to us about military families at large, and specifically about the impact of relocation on families. To start, I'm going to turn to each of you to introduce yourselves to the listeners, including who you are and what perspective or perspectives you are representing today. Shannon, can I start with you, please?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Shannon Hill. I am currently a research associate with the Families Matter Research Group at Queen's University, which is led by Dr. Heidi Cram. FMRG is an interdisciplinary group that produces research on a range of topics focused on families of military, veteran, and public safety personnel. So to today's conversation, I bring a few perspectives. The first one is the research perspective. So my graduate work largely focused on better understanding and supporting the educational experiences of Canadian military connected children and youth, with my PhD work specifically focusing on the school transition experiences of adolescents living in Canadian military families. And then the second perspective I bring is that of my lived experience. So I grew up in a Canadian military family myself. So I have that firsthand experience of what it's like to frequently relocate and navigate some of the known challenges that can be associated with the military lifestyle. So super excited to be here today and really looking forward to seeing where our conversation goes.
I am too. Thank you very much, Shannon. Thank you for being here. Why don't we move over to Dr. Cathcart?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Much like Shannon, I grew up in a military environment, um, um, moving several times as a young individual. After which I did serve in the military for about 26 years. And then, upon the conclusion of my military career, I realized there was a bit of a gap for post secondary military connected learners. So that's the space in which I work today, in interrogating that gap. I'm also married, proudly married to a senior Canadian Army officer, which then means I'm a military spouse, and all of the challenges that come with supporting her career as she continues to navigate life in the Canadian Armed Forces. In aggregate, I have lived experience from both, from multiple sides, from a young child living overseas, with my family, my own military career, and then supporting my uniformed loved ones. So I look forward to this conversation and learning from everyone else. Thank you, Nick.
Excellent, Daryl. Thank you. I'm loving to hear there's different perspectives that are coming, which is fantastic. Todd, can we go to you next, please?
Sure. Thanks, Nick, and good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. So I'm Todd Stride. I'm the acting Senior Vice President of the Military Family Services Division in Canadian Forces Morale Welfare Services. So for the uninitiated, Canadian Forces Morale Welfare Services, or CFMWS, is a social enterprise working on behalf of the Chief of Defence Staff in her non-public property capacity, and under the authority of the Minister of National Defence. So we provide a wide suite of national programs and supports to support members, veterans, and their families. And in the Military Family Services Division, we offer a combination of both virtual programs, as well as we work in partnership with our military family resource centers, which we provide the funding and oversight for across Canada. And these organizations really provide frontline supports to military families, and our programs are really positioned to support three key challenges or unique challenges that military families go through. The fact that they relocate every 2 to 3 years on average. The fact that military families have periods where one family member is pulled out of the family dynamic to support the operational requirements of the Canadian Armed Forces. And two, of course, uh, military families are always constantly confronted with the reality that the profession of arms is associated with a certain level of or chance of injury or illness, or potentially death. So The programs are really situated to address many of those programs. Myself personally, I'm a former Army reservist, but I've been working in the morale welfare space for over 2 decades now. So, it's always interesting to see how kind of the challenges evolve, and hopefully we work to evolve the programs to better support as well. And happy to be here.
That's great. Thank you. And then Paul, over to you, please.
Hi, everybody. Paul Hook, a former military member. I did 25 years. I'm fourth generation Canadian military. So when I was a kid, I lived across Canada and also in Europe and then the United States. So going through the educational systems in both of those countries. And then when I was in the military, I took my kids again all over the country and then out to the Middle East in the American system. So that's kind of my lived experience for this discussion today. I'm currently the managing director at Simver after retiring a couple of years ago. So great to be here.
Great. Well, as you can see, this is a fantastic group, which is going to be a very fruitful conversation, which I'm excited to be a part of. Families have really started coming to the forefront of the conversation in recent years, thanks to a lot of work by, of course, all of you and the work you do both in and outside organizations within the CAF and D&D. Of course, people like Heidi Cram, Dr. Heidi Cram, and Garnet Families. We really see a lot of movement in this space. And we've heard the term recently of families in their own right. So I think that's a key topic of relocation. It's not just the serving member that's relocating, but it is the entire family oftentimes relocating. We know that this includes significant impacts on the family. And I'm going to turn over to you, Todd, first. You had mentioned that relocation is one of the key challenges. So what are we hearing from families more recently that might be different from what we've heard in kind of previous years? And we'll start with you, Todd, but of course, anyone's welcome to jump in at any time and keep this conversation going.
Yeah, I think what's evolved is we've seen an amplification of the generalized shortage of many primary health and support services in many communities, right? And that's only amplified by the relocation aspect for military families. So, you think about primary health care, there are approximately, 6.5 million Canadians don't have a primary care physician. Well, what we're hearing from military families is the fact that, the profession of arms often requires them to move every couple of years. They're having even more difficulties getting reattached to the local healthcare system. So there's a pronounced period of going from wait list to wait list. You add things like special needs supports, and without an extended social network, because often they have no extended family in a new community that a military family may be arriving in, can make things even more difficult. Add on to that the affordability challenges that many Canadians are struggling with right now, again amplified by the relocation. And I think certainly the pay increases for military members has been extremely well received, I think, from families we talk to. But again, with the average house price in Canada of over $800,000 a year, moving across different housing markets can be a challenge. Or finding affordable rental housing. Add on to that, I think the geopolitical context is more challenging, I think, than many of us can remember in recent memory. So I think, like many Canadians, military families again are faced with a level of uncertainty, not knowing where their loved ones will potentially could be deployed in the near future and what that looks like. And then I think finally, the demographics within the military family constituency continue to evolve as well, and we need to be mindful that we have multiple personas, within the military family constituency. It's just not one monolithic entity, right? And as the Canadian Armed Forces works to recruit from a wider sample size of the Canadian population, we need to continually be mindful of that as service providers, that we remain responsive to wide elements of the Canadian demographic.
Nick, if you don't mind, I jump in on that. Todd brings up a lot of great points that I'd like to speak to, but overarching is really the impacts. Frankly, and I'll use some pedestrian language. They're never ending. I was medically released from the Canadian Armed Forces, and thankfully, a non-life threatening, chronic disease. I came into this, with my eyes closed and thinking, hey, well, I know what the military's like. I grew up as a kid, living in Europe in the heydays in the 80s. I had my own career. How hard can it be, really, to support somebody in uniform? I know it all. Well, that's not the case. So not only was I navigating a medical transition, not only was I navigating a professional, transition. What am I going to do next? The purpose and the identity. Then came the impacts that Todd speaks of. Staying at home, taking care of the family, and the trinity of those impacts. Really was eye opening, and made me re-examine priorities. And really, how can we support those in uniform? These are not buzzwords. We're talking about people and children and challenges. And the final thing I would say on this, and Todd's very astute impacts. My wife and I are about to go into our 10th move in 20 years. That includes 2 international. That includes 2 periods of imposed restriction. And I'm sure we'll talk about IR a little bit later. Well, I have a medical, requirement for a specialist. And that's the first thing that's coming to the forefront, right? We're staying in Ontario, but I need a new specialist in Ottawa when we're about to be there this summer. So, Todd rightly says impacts, and I just didn't realize, as a former serving member, the depth of those impacts, and how we had to have to continually address each and every one of those. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Well, and I think this is a great start to the conversation because it hits on the breadth of the, and I don't want to say everything is a challenge, but it is an impact and it is a consideration. And we're seeing this from healthcare, and you're seeing this from the other piece I want to bring in that both, of course, Daryl and Shannon have experience in is in education and the transitions in education. And these are pieces that are fascinating because it's not only interprovincial, it's not only international, but you just, Daryl, highlighted some pieces of within the same province, the challenges that there are. So as we're exploring some of these different challenges, Shannon, I'm wondering if I can turn to you to talk a little bit about the educational piece. And to add on the last piece I'll say on it too is that we're not just talking about after service, of course, which there's a huge transfer of skills from what we see in military personnel from an education piece post service, but all of these challenges for families within service in these relocations. And I know, Shannon, that's where your work has excelled in education.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just actually wanted to go back just to the piece around context and the changing context in which military families are navigating today as opposed to 20 to 25 years ago, as it relates to the education piece, because I'm not sure a lot of people might know about the changing context. So we know previously that the majority of military families lived and resided on military bases, and there was a Department of National Defense funded school system that previously existed, and those schools were located on bases, and so many military families sent their children to these schools. And we know that the military lifestyle was really at the core of the educational approach in these schools. But that schooling system within Canada was actually slowly phased out in the 1990s due to budget cuts. And so within Canada, those schools actually no longer exist. And so if we move forward to present day, we know that the majority of military families are now living off of military bases and within local communities and accessing similar services as civilian families are, including schooling for their children. And just as a side note, though, there are still 2 D&D funded schools that are operational overseas. So AF North International School in the Netherlands and then Shape International School in Belgium. They both have Canadian sections. But I don't think a lot of people might know that there was a D&D funded school system and now, there isn't. And so there isn't really a lot known within Canada about the experiences that, children and youth from military families are having in what we term sort of civilian schools or public schools. But what we do know from the limited research that has been done, certainly looking at academic challenges, and those can be particularly amplified with interprovincial relocations and school transitions. So we know that education, of course, is mandated by each province and territory across the country. So military connected children and youth can, experience curricular gaps and or redundancies. And then when we think about potentially differences in standards and requirements, so maybe entry into school or then looking at graduation requirements can differ across the country. And then certainly the social impacts. So frequently relocating requires military connected children and youth to leave behind old peer networks and have to develop new friendships. And that can be particularly challenging for adolescents, which is what my PhD focused on. We know how important peer networks play in adolescent development. So that can be really challenging. And then again, going back to the special education piece, right? Again, every province and territory has its own special education system in terms of eligibility, supports offered. So interprovincial relocations can really amplify those educational challenges for those children and youth.
So if I can, I just want to highlight some of I would say the benefits of posting. So Shannon and I have discussed this before, and I've spoken with Daryl based on our working together in Petawawa 20 years ago, and then seeing each other throughout both of our careers. So I mean, with the advent of some of the technology that exists for social media, instant communications, one of the great things that I've seen right now with my children, we moved from Israel in 2022, and my oldest went from grade 11 in the American school system back to the Canadian school system. The transition was less than ideal because the Canadian system is not set up post-secondarily to accept somebody that has a mix of American and Canadian or any other system. And then even provincially, Ontario universities don't really like to recognize a mix. They have to have certain indicators within the grade 12 system. So those are challenges. But I would say that from a social network, it's really difficult to make new friendships when you're a teenager. And I would say I have two daughters, so especially as a teenage girl, I grew up with a twin brother, so it was really easy for me and my brother whenever we were posted to have a new friend network, because I always had my best friend next to me, and it was easy for us. But now my kids, I see them and they still connect with people that they met 6 or 7 or 8 years ago overseas. So they're speaking with them as they've moved across the world. They have that global connection. And they develop a confidence. They have an idea of what the world is like. They have an idea of moving, of making new friendships, of learning new skills to be those people that are going to go out there and they have no choice but to develop friendships unless they want to regress and become an internal and then just fail miserably. And our family worked really hard to give them the support to make sure that they didn't do that and that they thrived. So we see those challenges as a way to bring our kids to be better globally, to be better as an adult because of those experiences, because of the challenges that they accepted that we thrust upon them. And so there are lots of issues with the system, and lots of great people like Todd and Shannon and Daryl are working together to make the system better. But there are some great things that are coming out, and you'll see the resilience in some of the kids, and the fact that families are working hard together. Like, Daryl and his wife have to live apart so that their family can ensure that their kid graduates from the same high school that he started with. And I did the same thing. And so we're making the sacrifices on behalf of our family for the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that's, the Chief of Defense Staff and everybody else in the military, they understand that. It would be great if you could put people first within the military, but that's not the mission. They understand that there are things that they have to make a priority. Um, but families are definitely becoming more of a priority within the Canadian Armed Forces, within Department of National Defense. So having these conversations and looking at policy changes are only going to make things better.
Nick, if you don't mind, I'd just like to add a comment to that, which kind of ties, Todd's impacts and what Shannon was saying about the PMQs and Department of National Defense school system and Paul. Paul's absolutely right. My wife is in Ottawa. We live in a small rural town, north of Toronto right now, to get my son through high school. And this is the first community that we've lived in, in our almost 20 or almost 10 moves now, that is not a military community. And, all of us on this call get it. We understand, we can, quantify the positives and negatives and really, start to investigate this. But for our entire family, not just the resilience that Paul speaks of with my son, living in a pure civilian community, educating them and having these conversations, about the impacts of moving, the challenges. Hey, we moved from Germany to this town. Hey, how was it living in Europe? Like, seeing my son have that confidence, and really beam up to talk about playing basketball in the Netherlands, in grade 8, right? And I just get to sit back and have him educate those around him. That's a unique experience that most Canadians don't get. The aft side of that is, our family is split up, arguably, in one of the most important years in my child's life as he, prepares to go off to university. So that comes with its own set of challenges and whatnot. So, it is a unique perspective, and, there are positives that come out of it. We get it, but, it's the important communication to the rest of, our Canadian colleagues and, articulating these challenges.
I think that's an important point that Daryl hits on, right? And Paul mentioned as well. There are certainly positives, right? And I think if you look at the internal CAF data, like the quality of life survey and some of the work that DGMPRA is doing, overwhelmingly military families, despite the challenges that they're confronted with, report being resilient and feeling able to deal with the challenges that they're faced with. But we know, there's a portion that are struggling. And albeit the minority, it is linked to CAF retention for sure, right? And when you look at the exit surveys that the CAF does, like looking at why members leave the CAF, the first reason is other employment opportunities, because we have a lot of the best and brightest in Canada that are very skilled individuals in the Canadian Armed Forces. They may choose to seek employment elsewhere. But when you look at reasons 2 and 3, they're family related more often than not, right? So while we know, like I said, like most military families report being strong and resilient, like I think the department is smart in kind of looking at, okay, how can we better the conditions for success, and like how can we mitigate some of the challenges? But again, to Daryl's point too, right? Like a military member operates in an ecosystem and gets most of their support services from the Canadian Armed Forces or from D&D, right? The military family, however, gets bounced from ecosystem to ecosystem. So if there's no recognition of the unique challenges and the mobility that they're subject to, it's not going to lead to an ideal outcome. So having folks like Shannon that are doing research in this space and working to build cultural competencies, I guess is the right word, like within these different ecosystems, sets us up best for success. Because the reality is the bulk of the heavy lifting support services that families are going to get, healthcare, education, you name it, employment, is going to be in the community. So it's to our benefit to kind of work in tandem with communities to educate them on what's unique about military families, what they bring, the positives they bring to the community, but also some of the unique challenges they're subject to.
I think, Todd, Christmas just passed, but if I had a wish for 2026, it would be for funding from the federal government to do more research for military families. And some of the stuff that Shannon and Allison Mahar presented, and I think Deb Norris worked on as well, the HBSC survey, if if those results and the data from the research being conducted can actually hit the end users, and by end users, I mean all the superintendents of the school boards that are connected to the military. So, we helped Garnet Families, and I think there's something like 60,000, probably 70 or 80,000 kids of military families, and then a couple 100,000 from the veterans, right? So all of those kids are in schools, and the superintendents of the schools and the educators and the counselors, they need to become culturally competent about what it means to move from one school system to the other, or what it means to have your parent gone for 1 or 2 years, or constantly having to switch. And as Shannon talked about, those gaps in curriculum and the gaps in social connectedness. And so taking the research and making it have an impact on the school systems, so that, I'll give a personal example. When my daughter moved into the school in grade 12, why didn't any of her teachers introduce her to the rest of the school? Because she was the only person that had moved into grade 12 in the entire school, but nobody explained her context. So she had to go around to each of the teachers and try and explain, no, I came from the American educational system. I have to do this course again. Why? We need to be able to give those tools to the counselors, to the school boards, and have that discussion so that we can implement policy changes. And I think that that would be my wish for 2026, is funding that shows that the government cares more about the military families. And I know they do, but you got to put your money where your mouth is. And that's some of the stuff that would make the research even better, is to implement it around the country.
Yeah, and if I can just follow up on that, I think in terms of the building the cultural competency and raising awareness, at least on the education side, one of the challenges within Canada is actually that there are no formal mechanisms in place to identify military connected children and youth within the education system. So something that got brought up in both my master's work and my PhD work is that military connected children and youth are often being identified informally through things like them bringing it up themselves to their teachers that they live in a military family, or maybe they write about it in a school assignment, or maybe a teacher sees a parent come to the school dressed in their military attire and they make that connection. So I think the lack of formal mechanisms to identify certainly creates some barriers in terms of raising awareness. There's a great quote from one of the participants in my master's research that said, if you don't know who they are, you don't know how to support them. And that has always stayed and resonated with me. And I think that's really what I think is really important, specifically with the work that I've done with the youth, and then Dr. Allison Mahar with the Health and Behavior School Age Children survey, is actually collecting data from the youth themselves. That is a perspective we don't really have in Canada. It often gets captured through parents or service providers. So I think that's really important. And the data, the HBSC data that Allison's been working with, really is really incredible. It's the largest sample of military connected children and youth to date, which is phenomenal. So I'm really excited to see what comes out from that work, and where it can go in terms of impacts for policy and support moving forward.
Yeah, and I agree with you there, Shannon. And I'd also take it a step further, and I wonder, even if we did have an identifier, what does that mean to educators? Right? Like there's that piece of, okay, this person comes from a military family, but we don't know the challenges in the civilian world all the time. We don't know how to help that individual or what extra supports they might need. And I think that's a big thing around a piece that I try to harp on as much as I can, looking at my children's school too, is that our teachers spend a lot of time with our kids. And you look at the provincial system, and there's some challenges in Ontario for teachers, of course, and the number of class sizes, but it's easy for military children and family members to kind of sit in the back and get kind of lost in the shuffle. So then we do some work around Remembrance Week, which is great, but it's a year-round thing, and we don't know what pieces to hit on, what programs are available. So I think that's an important piece. And then the other piece I was wondering about is we talked about the sense of community, right? And I hadn't really thought about it, but you're right. Children growing up in a civilian community, not only growing up on bases, is a real opportunity to, number one, socialize in a civilian setting where you're not only in a military base, but also educate military or civilian community members. But I wonder how oftentimes people are sharing that. We've learned in healthcare from a qualitative standpoint that military members, you want to identify those individuals, but they don't always see why me telling my healthcare provider that I'm in the military or I was in the military matters today or matters to my healthcare. Our individuals, our family members in communities now, when they're trying to create a sense of community, letting people know or identifying that they're in the military, does that seem like something that's such an afterthought to their communities that they don't see those connections? Kind of, that's not even a question I'm posing, but just thoughts I gather about this idea of this identity in new communities and the decisions that family have to make, right? Like you think of Dale, you're talking about the opportunity to see a specialist. That's a year or two wait for a lot of specialists. Now you have to make that decision. Do you start that process over? Are you traveling, depending on even for a within a province relocation? What are you going to do? And then what impact does that have on the family members? Like there's so many pieces. I would love to know what decisions families are making. How do you make these decisions? What are people choosing to do?
And just imagine, so we're just talking about this as a community and moving, but the military, a third of the military is made up with francophones, and the Canadian Armed Forces has a large contingent of bases in the province of Quebec, and New Brunswick, the only bilingual province, and you've got a small French minority in Manitoba as well. So, Daryl and I both saw this, where you've got francophones that are posted to English units and vice versa, and so you have to move families, and that's, if you look at it not from a negative side, but just from it's a factual thing. You get to move to a new place and discover a new way of living because different cultures, even within Canada, do things differently. I lived in New Brunswick a lot. I've lived in Ontario, all over. So people do things differently. But how do you learn how to work in a new language for your kids? Do they look at that as a positive or is it a negative? And then how is the family going to adapt? And Daryl can attest to this from his current position. I was speaking with the Dean of Engineering at the Royal Military College, and they know through the last 30 or 40 years that kids that come from different provinces are not going to be as successful if they get into engineering at RMC because Ontario has a different educational system than each of the other provinces. And so they actually get, I wouldn't say remedial, but they get extra training to bring them up to the standard that Ontario has for education. And not to say that Ontario is better, it's just different. But they know that. So if you have military families that are moving from Comox in British Columbia to Bagotville in Quebec or to Trenton in Ontario, and they keep moving all around, they're not going to have all of the tools necessary to go to a university in one province versus another just because of the curriculum differences. And so how do we know this? We know it anecdotally. I don't know if research has been done on that. I know some of the universities know this, but how do you actually make allowances for that as kids go into post-secondary? And what are the challenges? And what is the federal government looking to do to deal with some of those issues?
Great point, Paul. And I'd like to talk about two things. One more aspirational and the other a little more practical and closer to home to speak about my son, specifically. When we have these conversations around post-secondary, we often get wrapped up in credit for prior learning. You talk to anybody in this space, and we talk about whether they're serving members, veterans, or family members who are connected to a uniformed loved one, and they're headed off or trying to continue their post-secondary degree, diploma, or certification, which is incredibly challenging. And Todd mentioned how often people move. That in and of itself is a challenge. But what we perhaps get a little too focused on is credit for prior learning. That's a very practical, A may equal B, so we will give you C. but we don't talk about the social constructs. We don't talk about the supports that are needed. You know, you gave a great example about about your daughter moving into grade 12. And this is where I move from the aspirational. Let's talk a little bit about the entirety of the challenges moving into post-secondary, and not just practical. You know, we are on IR. My family is on an imposed restriction this year. We made that decision as a family. The military did not force us to that decision. I say tongue in cheek, but you have to factor in all of the familial challenges with that. The so what out of that is, it's great to see that the Canadian Armed Forces is offering some enhanced benefits for those who move a little bit more. There's a different system now in terms of some compensation. The so what out of that is, when do we put our house on the market? So my son's he's been accepted to university. He's going to go off to school. Do we make him move twice? And we reunite as a family right after his high school graduation? Or do we perhaps take a financial hit, keep the house until August, so my son only has to move once, my wife and I reunite, in the NCR? These are some practical things that really fly under the radar. And I guess the last thing I would say on that, and it's not all negative. We've had some great work done by a lot of smart people over the last couple of years. There's momentum in the family space. The Canadian Armed Forces has a mission, which, if I wasn't medically released, I'd love to be part of today. But to do that mission, they need tanks and ships and planes. But they also need families. They also need families to support that uniformed loved one. So I'm glad to see that we're having conversations like this. I'm glad to see that there are folks working in this area. But there are so many implications, and I just have that that little implication of us. Do we move in June and make my son move twice, or August? That will never be considered. That will result in a negative impact, whether financially or emotionally, on our family. And there are hundreds of families who are going to be facing this decision point this year. These are the things that we need to continue to consider when we're developing programs and strategies and policies and the like.
And one thing I think with Shannon's work and Alison Mahar's work is the largest data set is now in existence. And that's great, because the majority of research, I think, that the Canadian military and Department of National Defense were looking at had to have been the US research, because that's all of that existed. But I can tell you, having lived overseas, there's an American international school system. So in every capital city of every country that the US has an embassy, there's an American international school. Same for the British, and same for the French. They have a lycée. So there's three. So the Canadians, we can choose to do each of those three schools. But those schools, trying to fit that school curriculum back into a Canadian curriculum when our kids move back to Canada doesn't work at all. It's somewhat similar. And my oldest is now in third year university, and she's on the honors list, and she benefited greatly from doing the American International School System. She had to go through a little bit of pain in grade 12, but that has set her up for success for the future. So there are positives and negatives, but I think to be able to understand the issues within the Canadian system for the Canadian Armed Forces, there has to be Canadian research. We cannot continue to rely on our NATO allies or the Five Eyes community, because they're different. They have those systems in place. And I know Shannon talked about the two schools in the Netherlands and in Belgium. We have hundreds of Canadian Armed Forces families posted to Europe. I think we're at 600 people now. And then we have tons that are posted to the US. Anyone in the US goes to a US public school, and there's nothing wrong with that. Those schools are really good. And D&D has the Children's Education Management System, so CEM. And I ended up meeting with those individuals, and they're great. we need more people in there, and we need them to get out, and we need them to talk to the researchers. We need them to get out and to talk to the school boards and the provincial ministries to figure out how we can make this a better system.
Just to add, like, in the aggregate, we've made progress. And like, I would agree with you, Paul, like the Canadian aspect and having Canadian focused research is paramount. But I remember, like, Simber, when the first family track was probably 15 years ago, it was a small cohort of researchers looking at this. And now, like I said, it's impressive. We have dozens of really smart people working in this space. So I'm confident we'll get there. And I think a lot has been done to kind of increase those cultural competencies in community, but a lot more work remains, right? But we do have military family resource centers do a great job engaging local school boards, right, on kind of unique challenges facing military families. We've done work with the College of Family Physicians to educate Canada's physician base. We have our own team, to complement kind of what CEM does on the public side. We have guidance counselors that help pathway plan. I think we supported over 1,000 families last year with curriculum changes like across jurisdictions, but a lot more can be done. We see, like, based on the generalized shortage of support services, we see through our charitable arm supporter troops, we see hundreds and hundreds of requests, families looking for supports for things like tutoring and like program financial supports related to accessing not readily available programs to support a child or youth with disability. We can do that. But a lot, like I said, the policy pieces have to follow suit, and not just from a federal level, at a provincial level and territorial level as well.
Yeah, and that's actually a great tie-in, because one of the pieces I was going to ask is what supports do families have? What programs do we have? And making sure that research is coming down to that ground level. And anyone can address this, of course, but do families feel like if they have to make one of these decisions, when to post the house, relocation, accessing specialists, children with special needs, relocating families at critical points in school years, and whether your family moves with you or you move by yourself, or dual serving families and how to operate, I feel like it used to be, we talked about when living on base, going back to the kind of the PMQs, was there was a sense of community, right? And where do you go? Well, you go to your neighbor, and that person can pop over for an hour to watch your son or daughter because they understand what you're going through. Do families feel like they have that place to turn? Like, Daryl, is this decision made between you and your partner and maybe your son, or is it made between like accessing different opportunities and programs and resources, speaking to MFRCs, other family members? Like, where do families turn to kind of navigate this system?
That's a great point, Nick, and clearly I'll speak anecdotally and from my own perspective on this, and I think two things can be true at the same time. I 100% agree with Todd's assessment that there's a great deal of momentum and traction. We're bringing clarity to all of all of the family challenges, the positives and the negatives. But at the same time, I will call it a civilianization. There appears to be a civilianization going on, and by that I mean, and it's not just because I live in a rural town without a great military footprint. The civilianization is we're kind of left to do it to our own devices, unless we have a complex problem. Whether that be medical, educational, advice and recommendations. I see more and more colleagues, to include my own family, just figuring this out by ourselves, right? It's near simultaneous to, while all the supports are increasing, well, so is accessibility to regular planning tools, right? We're facing the same challenges that, somebody who works for ABC Marketing moving from Edmonton to Ottawa, right? They have to move, they may have education challenges. So I don't see, from my perspective, an over-reliance or a greater reliance, a commensurate reliance on Canadian Armed Forces supported programming. I see families figuring it out for themselves. Is that right or wrong? We probably should rely on those around us who have shared lived experience, and not look at ABC marketing because we are a different population. But that's what I'm seeing, Nick, is more families figuring it out. As they move literally and figuratively from point A to point B.
Yeah, no, I would say that everything is becoming more complicated. Having grown up in the 80s on military bases, your family moved, the military member went on training, the family went to the school on the base. You knew you could find a doctor. You knew that the supports existed. Your neighbor could look after your kids if you went for a job interview. You hung out in the military quarters patch. Everybody understood each other and everybody was part of an insulated group. You could go to school, you could go to the movies, you could go to the grocery store, you could do everything on that base because it was a self-contained village, for lack of a better term. And as Shannon said, 85% of kids are now going to schools outside of bases. I lived in New Brunswick. I had a great house. I moved to Ontario. I had to spend more than twice what my other house cost in New Brunswick to buy the exact same type of house in Ontario. And then, do I live closer to the base because there's no access to private military quarters, so I couldn't live on base. So do I live close so that it's proximity for me? Do I have to find a school that is best for my kids, or where's the doctor going to be? So all of these different complexities that you have to add in. Where's my spouse going to find a job? Do I need to move close to them? So the generational difference between my parents versus me and the decisions I have to make that's best for my family and my career are completely different. There are about 15 or 16 different factors that I have to look at that were not there, which is why the military family resource centers exist now, because of all of those complexities that have changed since the fall of the Cold War and the force reduction plan of the 1990s. That, like, everything is different, and social media has helped. And as Daryl said, a lot of people have access to these planning tools, so they can choose to use military support programs, or they can choose to use civilian support programs. Everybody has a choice, and it's great when you go through and you move bases, you clear into the new base, so you almost like a checklist of A to Z. These are the things I have to do, and one of them is checking into the Military Family Resource Center. You can see what all of the things are that your family can access, whether it's childcare, counseling, finding out which schools are the best ones to go to, figuring out after school programs for your kids or your spouse to do training to find a new job or resume writing, and they're all there. That's great, but there's so many complexities now that didn't exist, which makes it more difficult, which adds stress to the family that has to navigate all of this stuff. And one of the worst things ever, one of the most stressful things you can do with your family in your whole life is move, because everything is up in the air and everybody reacts differently to it.
I know Todd is going to jump in, and I don't want to undermine this conversation, but I have great memories. Just to highlight, one thing that Paul said. I had great memories as a kid, Nick. We moved many times. My dad was posted to Germany 3 times in his career. But we used to have our own Canadian Armed Forces moving boxes. It wasn't Day and Ross or, one of the other companies. It was a big waxed Canadian Armed Forces movie, and it was like Christmas. Every time we got to the new place and open up and see our toys, and I vividly remember that, from those days. We were, it was a different time, back in the day. Sorry, Todd, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, it's all aligned with the kind of the same line of conversation. I think, like, again, I would argue the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of Defense has put a lot of time, effort, and resources into supporting families. But I would also argue the programs are useless if families don't know about them or don't understand them, right? And communicating with families is a challenge. We always say families don't read canned fortunes. So how do you, and they don't always self-identify primarily as a military family, right? So they're like define them. We got to use social media, and we, and and direct targeted promotion through different channels. Like I'm glad Paul you elaborated on the Military Family Resource Center, because they can be a clearinghouse for kind of everything that's available to families, but they need to know about the Military Family Resource Center to get connected, right? We have a family information line that's manned 24/7, and that too it can be a connector, right, to not just services offered by CFMWS, but to the larger CAF, as well as to their local community. And we see a wide variety of questions coming into the family information line directly from families. But again, I think the communications piece is going to continue to be a challenge, particularly, like I said, as I mentioned early on, as the demographics of the CAF evolve and become more stratified, we're going to have to need different communication channels and different approaches as well, to make sure no family is kind of left forgotten in our comms approach. So more work to be done for sure, but I think, again, if I look back 20 years, 2 decades ago, there's I think the complexity of the space we're operating in terms of family support is heightened, but so are the programs and services as well, and the resources available. But more work to be done, but I think we there has been progress for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's a job we can all share, is making sure that we're all working hard, we're all making advancements, but that has to be communicated down, which is a goal of all of ours, I could say. Shin, I had a question for you, because education has come up quite a few times, and we've talked about, so I went to school on a military base as a civilian, and I've always wondered, was there any work with, like, I realized I was on a military base geographically, but I didn't see much different than the previous civilian schools that I went to in terms of like conversations or educations. You would see newer kids coming into the classroom and kids leaving, not finishing the grade or something like that, where you had an awareness of being in the military. But when we had the military schools, was there a more kind of training, supports, resources for teachers? And now that we've spread out military families across cities, and Paul, this ties into your point too of where our military base is in Kingston's a desirable area for people to live. So it's hard to find housing there, even if you wanted to be close, and it's relatively expensive. So you have these individuals and families spread out across the city. Is there work being done right now with educators, resources being developed just to help support military families across cities and school boards?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I just want to touch on 2 previous points. So, Daryl, your point about the moving boxes, it actually just brought up a memory of mine. I remember when we used to move, we would have competitions of the stickers, I think they were orange, that got put on every item, and it was a competition to see between me and my step siblings who could collect the most stickers. I think it was the parents just not wanting to take the stickers off themselves, but that was like a thing that was in my family of like, it was always a competition to see who could get the most moving stickers. And then this actually ties in, I think, nicely to the question, Nick, that you just asked, but just in terms of increasing awareness amongst families about the supports and services that are offered. I'd also argue too, it's important to increase the service providers' awareness about services and supports that are offered, because there certainly are, like the MFRCs are a great resource. On the education side, there have been guides that have been developed. There's one that's called School Counselors Working with Military and Veteran Families, which is a great guide. But in both my master's work and my PhD work, educators aren't necessarily aware that these resources exist. So I think I would argue that both the families and the service providers need to be aware of those. And then, so more specifically to your question, Nick, I would say yes, I think there are certainly efforts being made. In my experience, I think it's very contextually based. And there are certainly great examples of, like I know the Halifax MFRC has a school outreach program that is great, that they go in to help support military connected students and educate the educators on, what it's like to live in a military family and some of the challenges that these students might face. Yeah, I would love, we actually don't know a whole lot, I guess, from a documented perspective of the D&D funded schools. I would actually love to do research about the two D&D funded schools that are located overseas. But I will maybe, I guess, put a plug in for one of my publications. Worked with Dr. Alan English, who's a military historian at Queen's, along with some other co-authors to look to sort of chart the course of education for military connected students in Canada. And I think it's a really cool historical perspective piece of sort of past, present, and then where do we go from here? And sort of building capacity and awareness and these services and supports was one of the things we talked about in that paper. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question. But yeah.
It's a great and the thing that got me wondering is so my wife is a teacher. Without me being at home, I don't think would have much understanding of the military or what that might look like. And but I do know they have professional development days, of course, and a lot of those are at the schools. But there's one or two every year that are all the schools in the Limestone District School Board come together to one school and they sign up for workshops. And these workshops are kind of different, either teaching or evaluation or I wonder if there's something that we could do to play a role in kind of just like military education, creating some awareness, how resources that could be available, like this counselors working with. I don't think a lot of people, I wasn't even aware of that resource. So it'd be great to post a link to that, but carry that into schools. It might be that one touch point that wouldn't make I'm not saying it's going to be the end all be all, but it would be something where we could have an outreach. And I wonder if they would allow somebody like Simver and represented by our community, Shannon, yourself, to sign up to lead one of these workshops with teachers that would be interested.
Well,
I mean,
and I think on that note too, one of the areas that I have also tried to do or focus on is also pre-service educators. So getting into sort of the Bachelor of Education programs. And I know I've done some sort of one-off guest lectures, and oftentimes what I have heard from Bachelor of Education students is like this is a population they would have never considered or thought about that they, you know, could teach in their classrooms and in their schools. And I think, especially if we think about Ontario, we know that about 40% of military families reside in Ontario. So when we think about the Ontario perspective, that's it's important for sort of to develop competency and awareness even before they go into schools and are interacting with these families and children. So I think the pre-service piece is also equally important in addition to professional development for currently for current educators and healthcare providers and other service providers.
Great point.
I mean, I think across both the research community and across CAF D&D and CFMWS, I know for sure we've made efforts to make inroads with the professional colleges and associations, and through Seamless Canada, which is kind of the interprovincial territorial working group on military families, right? Like we've always kind of suggested to the provinces and territories, elected officials can be a conduit to the different, ministries of education to help disseminate some of that information, right? And that's a message that's been taken from the department to the Council of Ministries of Education of Canada, but more work's got to be done. And the reality is, like, they have, I'm sure they have competing demands and competing constituency groups, right? So it's like, okay, how do we continue to advocate for the military family constituency? But it's important because I know, like I said, we've had our team of guidance counselors go to national association meetings, National Canadian Association of School Principals, for example, right? And the conversation that inevitably has at a booth in the corridors of some hotel at a conference, you'll get the school principal from a community like Petawawa or pick a community, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. They could tell us about military kids. They're very well attuned to kind of the challenges that are specific to children, youth, and military families. But you get to your larger urban centers where most Canadians reside, Toronto and Vancouver. Usually the response is, "Well, I have no military families in my school." And then when you dig a little bit deeper, they don't take reserve populations into consideration. They don't take Reg Force personnel working at recruiting centers, and they actually do have military families in their school systems. They're just not, aware of it, right? So the education piece is critical. For sure.
And I would, Todd, that's a great point. So about 10%, maybe 15% of international deployments for the Canadian Armed Forces have reservists. And part of the educational piece, especially with some of the work Simver's done with Mark Rogers from Australia and the books, is resources for teachers and resources for parents. How do you have that discussion with a kid if you're a teacher and you don't know what it's like to have somebody in your family deployed overseas where any moment they could be horrifically injured or killed? And that kid goes home and the spouse or the parent that's left at home with the family is in a constant state of stress of receiving a phone call or seeing on the news that something horrible happened. That transfers to the kid. That kid struggles at school and they're going to act out in one way or another. If that parent understands why they're doing that, or at least knows that they're doing that, there's a way that they can, at least have information that'll make them better able to deal with the situation with that individual kid. So whether it's a reservist from the Governor General Horse Guards or the British Columbia Dragoons that is deployed over to Latvia today, and that kid is in a school in an inner city and the teachers didn't even know that situation was going on. Those are some of the things that we've talked about from a national side, working with Canadian Forces Morale and Welfare Services with the books and with the Royal Canadian Legion to make sure that we have resources throughout the country for kids, for parents, for teachers. And there's just a new book coming out that came out late last year on moving. So it takes a generational look at a grandparent and a kid that's 4 years old and goes through their up to their adolescent years on moving from base to base to base, and what that means in the communication. But it also shows the growth, and I think that as a resource provides an understanding or a cultural competence for anybody, an educator, a counselor, or somebody else, so they understand the context of what kids are going through while they're trying to learn at school.
Absolutely. And we did a similar document with Kids Help Phone, right? Guide to working with military kids. So it kept the vernacular and the nomenclature really simple, right? It was designed for any adult, from an educator to a camp counselor who would potentially work with children or youth from a military family or connected military veteran connected family. So and again, it's got a lot of practicalities, a lot of research-based information, but a lot of practical tactical tools that folks may want to take in consideration when they're supporting military families. But it could be a spouse or partner who has a CAF member in their family deployed and now needs to advocate to their employer for flexible work options, right? Because they're solo parenting for an extended period, right? So I think this we could there's a lot of nuances to different populations that that we need to continue to to hammer home, right? Because again, to oversimplify it, it takes a village. When you think of the unique challenges facing military families, for sure, it goes across and outside the department, outside the wire, for sure.
And to build on, I would say extend it beyond just the element of risk that you had brought up too, Paul, right? With families overseas or in combat zones, it's the pieces of this child's missing a lot of school because they have to travel to their previous town in order to see a specialist, or there's a big change in behavior because teachers aren't aware that there's a posting season, and they found out about relocation a couple months ago, and we saw this change in behavior of now I'm leaving my friends and I'm going to have to move, and what does that mean? I think we're aware of conflict at times where we're aware of Remembrance Week, but we're not aware of a lot of these other disruptions that are critically important in changing behaviors.
Yeah, and Todd, that the 60-page document you talked about is absolutely fantastic. I read it last year. I love it. I would hope that as I was saying, my daughter's in third year. She's actually going to be a teacher. Wouldn't it be great if every provincial ministry that had concurrent and consecutive education classes gave that as part of their professional courses for teaching, so that they understand some of the context of who the families are? To me, that's how we make that matter. How do we get that as a policy into the provinces with the Seamless Canada that you're talking about?
Yeah,
if it's not already.
And there's no resources required to do that, right? It just needs time and attention, right? Requisite attention, right?
And Nick, that's what I wanted to highlight, right? Is Todd's mentioned it twice now, and I will continue to reinforce it. we're getting better every day. We're not to use a buzzword, but we are all in our own rights and fields leading our areas, our ecosystems, and educating folks. I think we're getting pretty good at the deployment aspects, right? We got that. We have a general, we being Canada and Canadians have a general understanding of that. Perhaps sometimes a little bit too much of a romantic idea of what a deployment looks like. But the military is a dangerous business. Army, Navy, Air Force, SOF. Every time somebody leaves the house with their uniform on, they're putting themselves in danger. That's not hyperbole. We have training accidents, far too frequently, despite the great safety record of the Canadian Armed Forces. And it is that aspect we need to get a little bit better at, right? Families being separated for extended periods, not just for imposed restriction, where when the family member is at work and the family stays behind, but for extended periods of training. Like, these are real issues that cause the same and similar impacts in the population that we're talking about. So that, I think, we can do a little bit more work on when we're educating our Canadian counterparts, is the domestic aspect of it. Todd hit, it was something we didn't talk a whole heck of a lot about, employment. Excuse me. Domestic employment of reserves and the families. We're about to go into firefighting season, forest fires. Who's going to be doing that? It's going to be reserves. It's going to be taking family members away. So some of that domestic piece, I think we could get a little bit better at educating Canadians.
And that's great. I actually wanted to go back to this point because it's been mentioned a couple times, and I know I'm cognizant of the time. I can't believe that we're close to the end with this conversation. It's just getting started, and it's a great conversation. But we've talked about spousal employment, and we've heard about from different organizations. We've heard from the federal government that veteran reemployment after service is a major priority, which I think is great to help support the transition of military veterans. But I haven't heard as much about spousal employment with relocations during service, after service. And I wonder how much attention is being placed there as well, because these are challenges with careers of spouses of armed forces members. And is there any supports or programs along the way to help those individuals?
Yeah, I can speak for CFMWS interventions and programs. We're fortunate. Since 2018, the Canadian Armed Forces put a lot of resources behind supporting spousal employment, and the reason, there's two pieces, right? Like, it's directly tied to retention and recruitment, right? Because there's a necessity now. I think everyone acknowledges there's a necessity for a two-income household most of the time, right? Or increasingly, given the affordability challenges military families are facing. But there's a self-actualization piece. As the Canadian Armed Forces looks to recruit the best and brightest of Canadian society, there's a better chance than not that the military spouse or partner is going to have career aspirations of their own. So there's a self-actualization piece, and actually over 70% of military spouses partners have post-secondary education, so college or university. And we're seeing, more, even with graduate, there's a higher prevalence now than ever of spouses with graduate degrees, right? So we've put efforts. We now have online career counseling that's available for any spouse who needs it. So they can get up to 6 sessions, confidential one-on-one with a career coach to work on their CV, do resume prep, interview prep, career orientation, discuss kind of how they want to orient themselves in their career trajectory. We also have a military spousal employment network, kind of mimicking what had been done early on in the veteran space with engaging Canada's leading employers to actually look to recruit and retain from the military spousal population. So we have a network now where I think we're over 50 national employers, and then we actually have an online platform where they can interact with recruiters. They can post their resume. Spouses can post their resume online, which allows the talent acquisition staff from the employers to peruse and actually do searches based on particular skill sets. And we have virtual career fairs, et cetera. And there's no shortage of employers that are willing to talk to us, because I think they recognize the value added that the military spouses and partners bring to an organization. Interestingly, military spouses I would argue, have benefited from the advent of telework, which has been accelerated, of course, after the pandemic. And historically, if you look at the internal CAF research, spousal employment was always one of the top 3 dissatisfiers, reported dissatisfiers when it came to relocation. It still is up there, but it's diminished. It's still prevalent, and we need to make sure we have the supports. But my sense is telework and some of the program supports have kind of helped mitigate some of the challenges, and we still have a lot to do, and we can't let the ball drop. So we're going to continue our efforts, but certainly telework has helped because it makes it easier for a position to be portable across moves. So, but it is, like I said, it's key, both from a financial standpoint and a self-actualization piece.
And Nick, just to answer the Veterans Affairs Canada side, so as you transition from the military, spouses are able to work with career transition services to look at career counseling, resume writing, interview prep, job searching, and sometimes job placement. So there are some prerequisites, and you have to see if you qualify, but spouses are part of that, and that's something that VAC and the Canadian Armed Forces Transition Group have worked at really well. So, when you're looking at doing the military to civilian transition, there are programs available for the military members, but it's incumbent upon them to help inform the spouses of the services that are in place to support them as they also transition out.
Yeah, that's great. All right, looking at the time, I want to say thank you to each of you. I feel like this conversation could go on much longer. I had a list of so many points to talk about and got through a few of them. So the conversation will not be done. But Shannon, Daryl, Todd, Paul, thank you so much for sharing this rich information with our community. And I thought it's really enlightened me with some points of kind of action items moving forward and things that we can consider in some of the work that we're doing. And of course, calls for, from CIMFER standpoint, more research in family health and well-being is critically important. So thanks again to each of you for being here today.